Special thank you to Cayleigh Elise for her collaboration in today's video. Once you're done being spooked out by these 4 cabin tales, be sure to head over to her channel where we examine the Keddy family cabin massacre. You won't regret it. Now sit back, relax, and enjoy. So my family owns a cabin on a small lake in New Hampshire. We go there every summer. It's basically our home away from home. There are other houses on the lake, quite a few near us, but beyond that it's a pretty rural area. Miles of woods stretch beyond the lake houses, so there's really no reason to be in the area unless you were hunting, own a lake house, or were visiting the lake for whatever reason. So one night, maybe 6 years ago, it was late, probably around midnight. My ex and I were laying in bed just chatting about whatever. All of a sudden we hear footsteps outside the open window. The window lays only about halfway up on the wall to the side of the bed and is situated so that it opens right at the bottom of the bed where our feet are. The ground around my house is covered in a layer of pine needles that drop from above, so it's pretty hard to walk quietly. But the footsteps sounded like whatever was making them were trying their best not to be heard. They sounded relatively close, but we rationalized to ourselves that they were probably being made from some sort of animal. A couple of minutes go by and we hear them again, except this time they seemed closer. They seemed to be right outside the window, still trying to move quietly. At this point, the two of us are starting to get a little freaked out. To our mutual horror, we look down and see a hand slowly coming through the window. We scream and wake the house up, and my parents come running out of their adjacent room. We tell them what happened, and my father rationalizes it as the event being a figment of our imaginations. To this day, I don't know if he was right. The weird thing is that both my ex and I saw the same thing, so how could it be our imaginations? To this day I feel uneasy staying in that room, and I always make sure to shut the window before I go to bed.
I was 11 when this happened. Ariel, my older sister, was 14, and Belle, my younger sister, was 8. My dad was a freelance programmer when I was younger. He made great money on his jobs, but because he was so heavily in debt, $500,000 plus, and my mom was not the most gifted person on balancing a budget, we never had much free money available. This meant that we went on vacation once every few years, and usually it was to a relative's house. My dad had just finished a long project for a big client, and we were celebrating the occasion with a new movie, Final Destination, because my dad loved watching scary stuff and scaring the daylights out of my sisters and me. We were in the middle of the movie when the phone rang. He went to get it and came back to grab Mom while we kept watching the movie. Belle took the opportunity to pause the film and take Duchess, our dog, captive because she was scared. They came back about 10 minutes later and announced that we were going to be spending the weekend in a cabin. We didn't know what to make of that, but apparently the client he'd been helping owned a nice cabin by a lake in the mountains and offered to let us lodge there this weekend for a considerably reduced price. It was Thursday, so my mom went into a panicked frenzy of packing, so we didn't see the rest of the movie that night. After school the next day, we packed up the family van and headed to the mountains. It was a 2.5-hour drive, so it was late by the time we got there. We unloaded the van and went exploring in the cabin. It was a ranch-style cabin with a little nook you could climb up that was about head height. It was about 3 feet tall and probably meant for storage, but it was an excellent place for the 3 of us to hang in and play games. There were a few dozen board games up there, so we started playing once we decided on rooms. Mom and Dad got the largest one, Ariel claimed the smaller one with a twin bed, so Belle and I got the last room, which had a queen-sized bed we could share. We had a window on the right side of the bed, without a curtain, and a lamp on the left side of the bed. It was the only light source in the room, and there was a closet opposite the bed. It was locked, and we couldn't get in. I never did figure out what was inside there. We went to bed at around 11. Belle is a kicker, so I slept by the lamp so she didn't end up knocking it over. I remember lying down, and I must have instantly fallen asleep because the next thing I knew, Belle was gripping my arm and trying to burrow under me. She was squeaking something in fright, and I couldn't understand what was happening. I sat up, looked towards her, and saw something pale and human-shaped moving away from the window. My sleepy brain took several moments to process what I was seeing, and then I was shooting out of bed and dragging Belle with me. We rushed to our parents, who told us that we were imagining things. Mom told us to go back to bed, and if we saw anything else, to let them know. I, much to my current annoyance, agreed with them and went back in the room with Belle. We switched positions because she refused to go back to bed by the window. I told her a story to get her to sleep and promptly conked out after her. I didn't wake up until morning. The next day we went exploring around the lake for about an hour before Dad decided we'd spend the day in town. They had a lot of small shops and my parents went into every one of them. We ate lunch and dinner in town and finally went back to the cabin. Ariel made a joke about something as we neared the cabin, and I remember everybody laughing before my dad suddenly held up his hand to make everyone stop. He took another step towards the cabin and pushed the door open with a single finger. I thought it was strange that the door wasn't latched, but didn't put the obvious together right away. "Dad?" Ariel shuffled nearer to Belle and me, but Dad gave his head a shake to let her know she needed to be quiet. He went into the cabin and disappeared inside for a minute or two, while we stood on the porch. Mom called out his name, and he called back that we could come inside. We found him standing in the middle of the living/dining room with a frown. He locked the door once we were inside, and took Mom to the bedroom for a quick chat. Ariel, having caught on to what was happening, opted to distract Belle and me by suggesting another round of the board game we'd been playing the night before. We hadn't been playing more than 5 minutes when Mom and Dad came back. Mom went about cleaning the dishes from breakfast, while Dad joined our game. We played for a few hours before Dad told us we needed to go to bed. It was only 9 at that point, which made Ariel mad. She was allowed to stay up until 10:30 on school nights and later on weekends. Belle and I went to bed while they argued. We climbed back into the same spots we slept in, Belle by the window and me by the lamp. I read to Belle for a bit before we drifted off. I woke to Dad rushing into our room. He scooped Belle out of the bed and grabbed my hand, dragging me out of the room and into the hall where I saw Ariel getting similar treatment by Mom. I became aware of a high-pitched whine in the living room and saw our dog sitting at attention by the back door. She was bristled and seemed anxious. Dad didn't put Belle down and didn't let go of my hand. We rushed out of the house and into the van. Dad went back to get our dog, and then he burned rubber getting away from the cabin. He drove all the way back home without talking once. It took a half hour for Duchess to calm down. He told Ariel what happened the next day, but Belle and I didn't find out until years later. He'd woken up that night to what sounded like moaning outside the window in his room. He jumped up and looked to see what was going on and had found the front door unlocked. Stuff in the kitchen had been moved, and Duchess started to growl at the back door, which was ajar. He locked it and got us out of the house. He went back the next day to get our luggage and found several pairs of footprints outside mine and Belle's window.
It was about late November in Colorado, and I was about 7 or 8, and my father got the idea of taking us all for a weekend to a cabin that he was going to rent. My mother thought it was a great idea for me, my sister, my father, and my mother to bond. So that's exactly what happened. We rented a cabin for a few days. We took off school on Friday to get a head start on getting there, which I had no issue with. Upon arriving, It was incredibly cold. We got all set up and decided where we'd all sleep. We ate dinner, and then we all set up for bed and were thinking about what we'd do tomorrow. We got there kind of late, so we couldn't do much for the first day. That night, though, I heard noises outside, and it kind of sounded like footsteps. I looked out the window and saw nothing, so I figured it might have just been an animal. I tried to go back to sleep, but about 15 minutes later, I heard it again. I woke my sister up, which she was about 11 at the time, and she heard it as well. We both walked over to the window and saw something out there. We weren't quite sure what it was. We decided it best for it not to see us, so we went back to sleep. I had a hard time sleeping that night, and so did my sister. But when we eventually woke up, my mother was inside making breakfast, and my father was outside. I asked my mom if I could go outside with my dad, and she told me sure, while my sister stayed inside and waited for my mother to finish breakfast. I walked outside, and my father was talking to some man, a short, chubby man. He had a shaved head and was wearing a veteran cap. He looked really nervous too for some reason. He was sweating a lot as well, even though it was freezing outside. I walked over to him and my father looked at me and said, "Oh, this is my son," and told him my name. The man looked at me and said, "Nice to meet you, kid. My name's Patrick." He smiled and looked at me. I smiled and greeted him back, and it may have been rude at the time, but I was just a kid and asked him, "You look kind of scared. Are you all right?" And he kind of coughed and replied, "Yeah, I'm fine. Just went through some shell shock. I'm a veteran," he said, as I couldn't already tell with the cap he was wearing, and he seemed relatively normal then. My father seemed to really like this guy, and I liked him too at first. He told my father he had also rented a cabin with his family and that they were really close to us, so he decided to introduce himself. My father invited him inside for breakfast, and he stayed, and everything was normal. I went outside to play after that with my father and Patrick. While outside, I fell and scraped my knee and started crying. My father was inside at the time, a bad time for him to be inside. My mother was calling for him, and he ran inside while I was out there with Patrick. Patrick ran over to me and told me to come with him to his cabin because he had band-aids. I agreed and went with him. I wasn't the smartest kid. I went with Patrick, and we talked about what I liked doing, and I told him about video games that I played and stuff like that. Then things got weird. He asked me what shoe size I was and how old I am. I didn't know what my shoe size is, and I told him, but I told him my age. He just kind of chuckled and said something along the lines of, "Good to know." Also, his cabin was nowhere near ours. It was way back. It took about 20 to 25 minutes to walk there. I was tired and there was no point in getting the band-aid anymore, but I still decided to keep going since I had walked so long. We entered the cabin, and he told me to go in first, so I did. As soon as I walked in, I realized something. There was nobody in there. No family. I asked him where his family was, and he didn't answer, pretending like he didn't hear. He locked the door. I immediately felt mildly frightened. He told me, "I'll be right back with the band-aid, kiddo." He walked into the kitchen and pulled one out of somewhere, and then walked back and told me to have a seat and he'd put it on. I sat down and he put it on me. He also held my leg with his other hand and rubbed it up and down and told me, "You're rather muscular, kid. I like that." I kind of got scared and immediately stood up. He asked me what was wrong, and I told him nothing and that my leg was feeling much better. I then thought my parents must be worried sick about me and that I should hurry back. He insisted that I stay a little longer and ate there. I didn't want to, but I was alone, and if I ran, I don't think I could find my way back to my cabin. The door was locked too, so I just agreed and decided to eat with him and get it over with fast. He asked me how much I weighed, and I guessed around 73 pounds. He then had a smile go across his face. He nodded and said, "Perfect weight." I asked him perfect weight for what, and he just kept smiling. I was really weirded out and asked him if I could go. He told me no, and that things were just getting started and I shouldn't miss out on the fun. He had such a weird tone when he said that too. I then heard a big bang come from the bedroom. It was the closing of a door. Patrick stood up and looked kind of angry. He walked into the room and shut the door behind him. I then heard him yelling, "Did I fucking tell you that you could move? No. Stay the fuck where you are. I have fucking company." Or something like that. He then walked out with a smile on his face and shut the door slowly. "Sorry about that. It was just my wife. She's really sick and not allowed to be near visitors today." He was smiling while saying this. I wanted to go more than ever. I then looked around the room and noticed there were clothes everywhere, and it was really messy. He must have been living out here. At that moment, his wife walked out of the room. "I'm hungry," she said. He looked pissed. "Get back in there," he said. His wife was extremely pale and looked like she had been crying a lot. She was sniffling and had red circles around her eyes. She looked at me, then walked back into the room. I asked him where his kids were. He didn't answer. He told me he had kids' clothes that he wanted me to try on. And that was the last straw. I had to get out of that situation and I didn't know how. I started crying and then he hugged me. He told me, "It'll be okay, little one. Nothing is going to happen. Just try on these clothes." He walked into the back room. I thought that was the perfect time for me to leave. I unlocked his door and tried to leave as quietly as I could. I didn't care if I got lost anymore. I didn't want to take any more chances with Patrick, if that even was his real name. I had a feeling he had been lying. He lied about having kids, so who knows what else. I was in the woods trying to find my way back. I was still close to his house, close enough to hear shouting. I heard him yelling stuff to his wife, things along the lines of, "Where the fuck did he go? And I knew I shouldn't have left him alone. You probably let him leave." I could have sworn I heard him call her whore and bitch a couple of times. Then it happened. I stopped in my tracks. I heard footsteps, and I went and hid behind a tree and looked in his direction. He was outside and seemed to be looking for me. I was far enough away to where I could barely see him, but I could tell he was looking for something. He then stepped out into the forest and I heard him shouting, "Hey kid, it's okay. You can come back now. You don't have to try on the clothes. And I have toys back in the cabin. All you have to do is come back." I then ran. I ran as fast as I could in a straight line in hopes to find somebody or anybody that could lead me to my family. I was running away, and I thought I heard shouting, but I didn't stop to listen. Then after about an hour of running, I saw a cabin. My cabin. I ran to it. My father was outside looking around, looking for me. I ran up to him crying and told him Patrick wasn't a good guy and that he was really weird and was touching my legs. My father immediately called the person he rented the cabin from, and he said that nobody had rented that cabin. My father looked at me square in the eyes and told me to never follow any stranger ever again. We immediately left that day and asked for a refund for the next day. The guy renting them out apologized. The man having the cabin rentals called the police, and the police went back there and checked the cabin, but there was nobody back there, not even his wife. They told us that his clothes and belongings were still there. Nothing really happened after that. They asked questions and left. They never called or told us anything about him ever again. Patrick most likely wasn't his real name, and he probably wasn't a veteran. I just want to know what happened to him and his wife, and how he even got a wife in the first place, and how and why he lived back in that cabin. He seemed to have lived there for a while. I guess he left because he figured the police would have been coming after him because he didn't rent the cabin. So many questions that will never get answered. I'm just glad that it's all over, and I hope I never have to see that cabin man again.
So, this happened at Christmas a couple of years ago when I was spending the holidays with my parents and little brother, along with my cousins, aunts, and uncles. We live in a suburb in Ontario, but we were venturing out into the woods for Christmas, an idea that my parents had had for a while. They always loved the idea of being out in the hunting cabin during a Christmas with their families. I'm a 22-year-old female, but at the time, I was newly 18, and my little brother Tom was 11. We're really close and do everything together. We also had a dog, a German Shepherd called Trigger, who came along for the ride too. He's a real softie, but can be really overprotective, especially of my brother Tom. Anyways, we left from our house on Christmas Eve at about 2 p.m. and climbed into our dad's truck, filled with all of our stuff and presents for his extended family. Tom and I were really excited, winding each other up, and my parents were having friendly conversation as we moved along down the road. We arrived at the village near the cabins we were staying in and caught up with my dad's sister, Billy, along with her husband and 3 kids. They didn't converse for long, but Billy was a bit unsure of where to go from the village to get to the cabins, so my dad helped her out by writing down the directions. We soon got back on our way and arrived at the cabins at around 4 p.m. There was a cluster of them sort of spaced out around the woods. Each family had a cabin, and there was one where everyone could meet up with a pool table, a swimming pool, and all sorts. It was kind of a place we could all just chill together and enjoy each other's company. Anyway, the weather was already really cold when we arrived, and the snow was falling all around us, so me and my brother unpacked our things into the cabin and settled in for the night. My dad started a fire whilst my mom made our dinner. It was great. The Christmas decorations were already up, and we played a few board games as the night got darker. Dad, Tom, and I decided before coming on the trip that we'd go hunting sometime, so we planned to go the next day. I'd been a few times with my dad, but this was Tom's first time. He was only there to watch us, though, as he was too young to shoot. It reached about 10 p.m., and my brother and I were getting a bit tired, so we decided to go to bed. My dad kept his rifles in a bag, which he kept under the bed I was sleeping on. He'd usually keep it in a locked box, but thought there was no point since we were going hunting the next morning. Tom and I were sharing a room at the end of the cabin, facing a flowing river, and the view was beautiful. Tom and I fell asleep with our dog, Trigger, lying at the bottom of Tom's bed. Now, this is where things begin to get creepy. It was about 3 a.m. when I awoke to Trigger growling. I didn't find this particularly unusual because my dad suffers from insomnia, so sometimes when he can't sleep, he sits in our sitting room at home and watches some TV. Like I said, Trigger is extremely overprotective and growls at any noise he hears, but that's when I noticed that there was no light coming from under my door. My dad never just sits in the dark. I whispered to Trigger, telling him to be quiet as Tom slept, but his growling soon turned to barking, which woke Tom up. He asked me what was going on, but I said Trigger must have heard a deer or something outside. After all, we were in the middle of the woods. Suddenly, our bedroom door swung open and the light switch was turned on. My eyes stung as I tried to focus on whoever it was at the door. It was my dad. "Were you two laughing just now?" he asked as I turned to look at Tom, his eyes wide and his face pale. "No," I replied as he moved over towards our curtain, pulling it back as he looked out into the pitch-black wilderness. "What are you looking at?" Tom asked as our dad closed the curtains again. "Nothing. Just go back to sleep." I was kind of creeped out that my dad didn't say anything about what he was doing, but he turned our light off and we tried falling back asleep again. Of course, I couldn't. I was wide awake for the rest of the night, flinching at pretty much every noise. It was about 4:30 a.m. when I finally drifted off, but it must have been moments later I heard a strange crunching noise coming from outside our window. I was sure this wasn't some sort of animal. It sounded like footsteps. I had this overwhelming feeling of fear, and I pulled the covers over my face, sweat beginning to cover my forehead. I then heard a faint tapping on our window, which lasted for a good few minutes. I was so petrified I couldn't move. Trigger was awake by this point as I saw his face turn towards the window, his ears pointed and listening intently. The tapping started again, but louder this time, causing Trigger to bare his teeth. What happened next was the most terrifying thing that has ever happened to me. "I know you're in there, little guy," this deep and husky voice whispered as a horrible shiver went down my spine. "Why don't you come out here and play with me?" Initially, I was filled with rage. I thought that it was bound to be one of my cousins playing a stupid prank on us, so I leaned forward and peeked through the gap in the curtain, ready to give them hell for scaring the shit out of us. But standing there wasn't any of our cousins. It was a creepy old man who was around 60, his hair matted and his clothes looking dirty and ancient. He was stroking the window with his hands, breathing on it as he spoke. I went into protective mode. I didn't know what else to do, so I grabbed my dad's hunting rifle from under the bed and pulled the curtain back. "Get the hell out of here or I'll shoot!" I felt adrenaline rush through me as the creepy man's eyes widened and the most terrifying smile appeared across his face. Trigger began barking louder than I've ever heard him bark. My parents obviously heard the commotion and came running through to our room, turning the light on. My mom screamed as she saw the old man through the window, Trigger fiercely continuing to bark at him. My dad yelled at the man, telling him that the police were on their way, but the man legged it back into the woods. Tom was petrified, but I was angry more than anything else. How could some sicko do this? I was just extremely glad I had the rifle. The cops caught the guy just a few minutes later and arrested him. I found out a couple of days later that the creepy man was homeless and had been living in the woods, and he was suffering from a lot of mental issues. It scares me to death to think about what could have happened to my brother if I hadn't been there. We spent the remainder of Christmas Day at the cabin, but we stayed in our Aunt Billy's cabin overnight. There was no way we were sleeping in our own after what happened. We went home first thing on Boxing Day and never looked back. My dad only told me the other day that he knew someone was hanging around at our cabin, so he intentionally left the rifle under my bed in case I had to use it in self-defense. He did that because he didn't want to scare any of us. He called the cops after he heard the guy laughing outside of his bedroom window, singing nursery rhymes. He knew it would take a while for the cops to reach the cabin. Safe to say, that was the scariest experience of my life. So, weird, creepy old guy in the middle of the woods, please, let's not meet again. Special thanks to Let's Read for having me on his channel today. Be sure to head on over to my channel for the second half of this collaboration where we present to you the tragic case of the unsolved Ketty Cabin murders, a quadruple homicide that has remained unsolved for over 3 decades. Thanks again, stay safe, and I'll see you soon.
We look down and see a hand slowly coming through the window. We scream and wake the house up, and my parents come running out of their adjacent room. We tell them what happened, and my father rationalizes it as the event being a figment of our imaginations. To this day, I don't know if he was right. The weird thing is that both my ex and I saw the same thing, so how could it be our imaginations? To this day, I feel uneasy staying in that room, and I always make sure to shut the window before I go to bed.
I was 11 when this happened. Ariel, my older sister, was 14, and Belle, my younger sister, was 8. My dad was a freelance programmer when I was younger. He made great money on his jobs, but because he was so heavy...
Special thank you to Cayleigh Elise for her collaboration in today's video. Once you're done being spooked out by these 4 cabin tales, be sure to head over to her channel where we examine the Cayleigh family cabin massacre. You won't regret it. Now sit back, relax, and enjoy. So my family owns a cabin on a small lake in New Hampshire. We go there every summer. It's basically our home away from home. There are other houses on the lake, quite a few near us, but beyond that it's a pretty rural area. Miles of woods stretch beyond the lake houses, so there's really no reason to be in the area unless you were hunting, own a lake house, or were visiting the lake for whatever reason. So one night, maybe 6 years ago, it was late, probably around midnight. My ex and I were laying in bed just chatting about whatever. All of a sudden we hear footsteps outside the open window. The window lays only about halfway up on the wall to the side of the bed and is situated so that it opens right at the bottom of the bed where our feet are. The ground around my house is covered in a layer of pine needles that drop from above, so it's pretty hard to walk quietly. But the footsteps sounded like whatever was making them were trying their best not to be heard. They sounded relatively close, but we rationalized to ourselves that they were probably being made from some sort of animal. A couple of minutes go by and we hear them again, except this time they seemed closer. They seemed to be right outside the window, still trying to move quietly. At this point, the two of us are starting to get a little freaked out. To our mutual horror,
heavily in debt, $500,000 plus, and my mom was not the most gifted person on balancing a budget, we never had much free money available. This meant that we went on vacation once every few years, and usually it was to a relative's house. My dad had just finished a long project for a big client, and we were celebrating the occasion with a new movie, Final Destination, because my dad loved watching scary stuff and scaring the daylights out of my sisters and me. We were in the middle of the movie when the phone rang. He went to get it and came back to grab Mom while we kept watching the movie. Belle took the opportunity to pause the film and take Duchess, our dog, captive because she was scared. They came back about 10 minutes later and announced that we were going to be spending the weekend in a cabin. We didn't know what to make of that, but apparently the client he'd been helping owned a nice cabin by a lake in the mountains and offered to let us lodge there this weekend for a considerably reduced price. It was Thursday, so my mom went into a panicked frenzy of packing, so we didn't see the rest of the movie that night. After school the next day, we packed up the family van and headed to the mountains. It was a 2.5-hour drive, so it was late by the time we got there. We unloaded the van and went exploring in the cabin. It was a ranch-style cabin with a little nook you could climb up that was about head height. It was about 3 feet tall and probably meant for storage, but it was an excellent place for the 3 of us to hang in and play games. There were a few dozen board games up there, so we started playing once we decided on rooms. Mom and Dad got the largest one, Ariel claimed the smaller one with a twin bed, so Belle and I got the last room, which had a queen-sized bed we could share. We had a window on the right side of the bed, without a curtain, and a lamp on the left side of the bed. It was the only light source in the